The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 9, Side 1. It was Mantegna's last great painting. His final years were saddened by ill health, bad temper, and mounting debts. He resented Isabella's presumption to lay down the precise details of the pictures she asked of him. He retired into angry solitude, sold most of his art collection, finally sold his house. In 1505, Isabella described him as tearful, agitated, and with so sunken a face that he seemed to me more dead than alive. A year later he died, aged 75. Over his tomb in Sant'Andrea, a bronze bust, perhaps by Mantegna himself, portrayed with angry realism the bitterness and exhaustion of a genius who had used himself up in his art for half a century. Those who desire immortality must pay for it with their lives. 3. The First Lady of the World. La prima donna del mondo, so the poet Niccolo da Correggio called Isabella d'Este. The novelist Bandello considered her supreme among women, and Ariosto did not know which to praise most highly in the liberal and magnanimous Isabella, her gracious beauty, her modesty, her wisdom, or her fostering of letters and arts. She possessed most of the accomplishments and charms that made the educated woman of the Renaissance one of the masterpieces of history. She had a wide and varied culture without being an intellectual or ceasing to be an attractive woman. She was not extraordinarily beautiful. What men admired in her was her vitality, her high spirits, the keenness of her appreciation, the perfection of her taste. She could ride all day and then dance all night, and remain every moment a queen. She could rule Mantua with a tact and good sense alien to her husband, and in the debility of his later years she held his little state together despite his blunders, his wanderings, and his syphilis. She corresponded on equal terms with the most eminent personalities of her time. Popes and dukes sought her friendship, and rulers came to her court. She subpoenaed nearly every artist to work for her. She inspired poets to sing of her. Bembo, Ariosto, and Bernardo Tasso dedicated works to her, though they knew that her purse was small. She collected books and art with the judgment of a scholar and the discrimination of a connoisseur. Wherever she went, she remained the cultural focus and sartorial exemplar of Italy. She was one of the Estensi, the brilliant family that gave dukes to Ferrara, cardinals to the church, and a duchess to Milan. Isabella, born in 1474, was a year older than her sister Beatrice. Their father was Ercole I of Ferrara. Their mother was Eleonora of Aragon, daughter of King Ferrante I of Naples. They were well equipped with lineage. While Beatrice was sent to Naples to learn vivacity at the court of her grandfather, Isabella was brought up amid the scholars, poets, dramatists, musicians, and artists that were making Ferrara for a time the most brilliant of Italian capitals. At 6, she was an intellectual prodigy who made diplomats gape. Though I had heard much of her singular intelligence, wrote Beltramino Cusatro to Marquis Federigo of Mantua in 1480, I could never have imagined such a thing to be possible. Federigo thought she would be a good catch for his son Francesco, and so proposed to her father. Ercole, needing the support of Mantua against Venice, agreed, and Isabella, aged 6, found herself engaged to a boy of 14. She remained for 10 years more at Ferrara, learning how to sew and sing, to write Italian poetry and Latin prose, to play the clavichord and the lute, and to dance with a sprightly grace that seemed to attest invisible wings. Her complexion was clear and fair, her black eyes sparkled, her hair was a mesh of gold. So at 16 she left the haunts of her happy childhood and became, proudly and seriously, the Marchioness of Mantua. John Francesco was swarthy, bushy-haired, fond of hunting, impetuous in war and love. In those early years he attended zealously to government, and faithfully maintained Mantegna and several scholars at his court. He fought with more courage than wisdom at Fornovo, and chivalrously or prudently sent to Charles VIII most of the spoils that he had captured in the tent of the fleeing king. He used the soldier's privilege of promiscuity, and began his infidelities with the first confinement of his wife. 7 years after his marriage, he allowed his mistress Theodora to appear in almost regal raiment at a tournament in Brescia, where he rode in the lists. Isabella may have been partly to blame. She became a bit plump, and went on long visits to Ferrara, Urbino, and Milan. But doubtless the Marquis was not inclined to monogamy in any case. Isabella bore with his adventures patiently, took no public notice of them, remained a good wife, gave her husband excellent advice in politics, and supported his interests by her diplomacy and her charm. But in 1506 she wrote to him, then leading papal troops, a few words warm with the hurt she felt. "No interpreter is needed to make me aware that your Excellency has loved me little for some time past. Since this, however, is a disagreeable subject, I will say no more." Her devotion to art, letters, and friendship was in part an attempt to forget the bitter emptiness of her married life. There is nothing more pleasant in all the rich diversity of the Renaissance than the tender relations that bound together Isabella, Beatrice, and Isabella's sister-in-law, Elisabetta Gonzaga. And few passages finer in Renaissance literature than the affectionate letters they exchanged. Elisabetta was grave and weak and often ill. Isabella was merry, witty, brilliant, more interested in literature and art than either Elisabetta or Beatrice. But these differences of character were made complementary by good sense. Elisabetta loved to come to Mantua, and Isabella worried more about her sister-in-law's health than about her own, and took every measure to make her well. Yet there was a selfishness in Isabella quite absent from Elizabeth. Isabella could ask Caesar Borgia to give her Michelangelo's Cupid, which Borgia had stolen after seizing Elisabetta's Urbino. After the fall of Lodovico il Moro, the brother-in-law who had lavished every courtesy upon her, she went to Milan and danced at a ball given by Lodovico's conqueror, Louis XII. Perhaps, however, it was her feminine way of saving Mantua from the resentment aroused in Louis by the injudicious candor of her husband. Her diplomacy accepted the interstate amorality of that time and ours. Otherwise, she was a good woman, and there was hardly a man in Italy that would not have been glad to serve her. Bembo wrote to her that he desired to serve her and please her as if she were Pope. She spoke Latin better than any other woman of her time, but she never mastered the language. When Aldus Manutius began to print his choice editions of the classics, she was among his most enthusiastic customers. She employed scholars to translate Plutarch and Philostratus, and a learned Jew to translate the Psalms from the Hebrew so that she might assure herself of their original magnificence. She collected Christian classics, too, and read the Fathers with courage. Probably she treasured books more as a collector than as a reader or a student. She respected Plato, but really preferred the chivalric romances that entertained even the Ariostos of her generation and the Tassos of the next. She loved finery and jewelry more than books and art. Even in her later years, the women of Italy and France looked to her as the glass of fashion and the queen of taste. It was part of her diplomacy to move ambassadors and cardinals with the combined allure of her person, her dress, her manners, and her mind. They thought they were admiring her erudition or her wisdom when they were relishing her beauty, her costume, or her grace. She was hardly profound, except perhaps in statesmanship. Like practically all her contemporaries, she listened to astrologers and timed her enterprises by the concurrence of the stars. She amused herself with dwarfs, maintained them as part of her entourage, and had 6 rooms and a chapel built to their measure for them in the Castello. One of these favorites was so short, said a wit, that if it had rained an inch more he would have been drowned. She was fond, too, of dogs and cats, chose them with the finesse of a fancier, and buried them with solemn funerals in which the surviving pets joined with the ladies and gentlemen of the court. The Castello, or Regia, or Palazzo Ducale, over which she reigned, was a medley of buildings of various dates and authorship, but all in that style of outer fortress and inner palace which raised similar structures in Ferrara, Pavia, and Milan. Some components, like the Palazzo del Capitano, went back to the Buonaccorsi rulers in the 13th century. The harmonious Castello San Giorgio was a creation of the 14th. The Camera degli Sposi was the work of Lodovico Gonzaga and Mantegna in the 15th. Many rooms were rebuilt in the 17th or 18th. Some, like the sumptuous Sala degli Specchi, or Hall of Mirrors, were redecorated during the rule of Napoleon. All were elegantly fitted out, and the vast congeries of residential chambers, reception halls, and administrative offices looked out on courts or gardens, or Virgil's meandering Mincio, or the lakes that bordered Mantua. In this labyrinth, Isabella occupied different quarters at different times. In her later years, she loved best a little apartment of 4 rooms, or camerini, known as Il Studiolo, or Il Paradiso. Here, and in another room called Il Grotto, she gathered her books, her objets d'art, and her musical instruments, themselves finished works of art. Next to her care for the preservation of Mantua's independence and prosperity, and sometimes above her friendships, the ruling passion of her life was the collection of manuscripts, statuaries, paintings, majolica, antique marbles, and little products of the goldsmith's art. She used her friends and employed special agents in cities from Milan to Rhodes to bargain and buy for her and to be on the alert for finds. She haggled because the treasury of her modest state was too narrow for her ideas. Her collection was small, but every item in it stood high in its class. She had statuary by Michelangelo, paintings by Mantegna, Perugino, Francia. Not content, she importuned Leonardo da Vinci and Giovanni Bellini for a picture, but they held her off as one who paid more in praise than in cash, and doubtless, too, because she specified too immutably what each picture should represent and contain. In some cases, as when she paid 115 ducats, or $2,875, for Jan van Eyck's Passage of the Red Sea, she borrowed heavily to satisfy her eagerness for a masterpiece. She was not generous to Mantegna, but when that ogre of a genius died, she persuaded her husband to lure Lorenzo Costa to Mantua with a handsome salary. Costa decorated Gianfrancesco Gonzaga's favorite retreat, the Palace of St. Sebastian, made portraits of the family, and painted a mediocre Madonna for the Church of Sant'Andrea. In 1524, Giulio Pipi, called Romano, the greatest of Raphael's pupils, settled at Mantua and astonished the court with his skill as architect and painter. Almost the entire ducal palace was redecorated according to his designs and by the brushes of himself and his pupils. Francesco Primaticcio, Niccolo dell'Abate, and Michelangelo Anselmi. Federigo, Isabella's son, was ruler now, and since he, like Romano, had acquired at Rome a taste for pagan subjects and decorative nudes, he had the walls and ceilings of several rooms in the Castello painted with inviting pictures of Aurora, Apollo, the Judgment of Paris, the Rape of Helen, and other phases of classic myth. In 1525, on the outskirts of the town, Giulio began to build his most famous work, the Palazzo del Te. A vast rectangle of one-storied structures, in a simple design of stone blocks and Renaissance windows, surrounds what was once a pleasant garden but is now a neglected waste in the impoverished aftermath of war. The interior is a succession of surprises, rooms tastefully adorned with pilasters, carved cornices, painted spandrels, and coffered vaults, walls, ceilings, and lunettes picturing the story of the Titans and the Olympians, Cupid and Psyche, Venus and Adonis, and Mars, Zeus, and Olympia, all in a revel of splendid nudes in the amorous and reckless taste of the later Renaissance. To crown these masterpieces of sexual license and gigantic strife, Primaticcio carved in stucco a grand processional relief of Roman soldiers in the manner of Mantegna's Triumph of Caesar, and almost with the chiseled excellence of Phidias. When Primaticcio and dell'Abate were summoned to Fontainebleau by Francis I, they brought to the royal palaces of France this style of decoration, with rosy nudes, which Giulio Romano had brought to Mantua from his work with Raphael in Rome. From the citadel of Christianity, pagan art radiated to the Christian world. The last years of Isabella mingled sweet and bitter in her cup. She helped her invalid husband to govern Mantua. Her diplomacy saved it from falling prey to Caesar Borgia, then to Louis XII, then to Francis I, then to Charles V. One after another she humored, flattered, charmed, when Gianfrancesco or Federigo seemed on the edge of political disaster. Federigo, who succeeded his father in 1519, was an able general and ruler, but he allowed his mistress to displace his mother as ruler of the Mantuan court. Perhaps retreating from this indignity, Isabella went to Rome in 1525 to seek a red hat for her son Ercole. Clement VII was non-committal, but the cardinals welcomed her, made her suite in the Colonna Palace a salon, and kept her there so long that she found herself imprisoned in the palace during the sack of Rome, this in 1527. She escaped with her usual adroitness, won the coveted cardinalate for Ercole, and returned to Mantua in triumph. In 1529, attractive at 55, she went to the Congress of Bologna, courted emperor and pope, helped the lords of Urbino and Ferrara to keep their principalities from being absorbed into the papal states, and persuaded Charles V to make Federigo a duke. In that same year, Titian came to Mantua and painted a famous portrait of her. The fate of this picture is uncertain, but the copy of it made by Rubens shows a woman still in the vigor and love of life. Bembo, visiting her 8 years later, was amazed by her vivacity, the alertness of her mind, the scope of her interests. He called her the wisest and most fortunate of women, but her wisdom fell short of accepting old age cheerfully. She died in 1539, aged 64, and was buried with preceding rulers of Mantua in the Cappella dei Signori in the church of San Francesco. Her son ordered a handsome tomb to be raised to her memory, and joined her in death a year later. When the French pillaged Mantua in 1797, the tombs of the Mantuan princes and princesses were shattered, and the ashes they contained were mingled in the indiscriminate dust. Chapter 10. Ferrara, 1378 to 1534. 1. The House of Este. In the first quarter of the 16th century, the most active centers of the Renaissance were Ferrara, Venice, and Rome. The student who wanders through Ferrara today can hardly believe, until he enters the mighty Castello, that this slumbering city was once the home of a powerful dynasty, whose court was the most splendid in Europe, and whose pensioners included the greatest poet of the time. The city owed its existence partly to its position on the route of commerce between Bologna and Venice, partly to the agricultural hinterland that used it as a mart and was itself enriched by 3 branches of the Po. It was included in the territory given to the papacy by Pepin III in 756 and Charlemagne in 773, and was again deeded to the church by the Countess Matilda of Tuscany in 1107. While formally acknowledging itself to be a papal fief, it governed itself as an independent commune, dominated by rival mercantile families. Disordered by these feuds, it accepted Count Azzo VI of Este as its podesta in 1208 and made this office hereditary in his progeny. Este was a small imperial fief, some 40 miles north of Ferrara, which had been given to Count Azzo I of Canossa by the Emperor Otho I in 961. In 1056 it became the seat of the family, and soon gave it its name. From this historic house came the later royal families of Brunswick and Hanover. From 1208 to 1597, the Estensi ruled Ferrara technically as vassals of the empire and the papacy, but practically as independent lords, with the title of Marquis or, after 1470, Duke. Under their government the people prospered tolerably and supplied the needs and luxuries of a court that entertained emperors and popes, and supported a notable retinue of scholars, artists, poets, and priests. Despite lawless cruelties and frequent wars, the Estensi retained the loyalty of their subjects through 4 centuries. When a legate of Pope Clement V expelled the Estensi and proclaimed Ferrara a papal state in 1311, the people found ecclesiastical rule more irksome than secular exploitation. They drove out the legate and restored the Estensi to power in 1317. Pope John XII laid an interdict upon the city. Soon the people, deprived of the sacraments, began to murmur. The Estensi sought reconciliation with the Church and obtained it on hard conditions. They acknowledged Ferrara to be a papal fief, which they would rule as vicars of the popes, and they pledged themselves and their successors to pay from the revenues of the state an annual tribute of 10,000 ducats, possibly $250,000, to the papacy. During the long rule, from 1393 to 1441, of Niccolo III, the House of Este reached the acme of its power, governing not only Ferrara but also Rovigo, Modena, Reggio, Parma, and even, briefly, Milan. Niccolo married as widely as he ruled, having a long succession of wives and mistresses. One especially pretty and popular wife, Parisina Malatesta, committed adultery with her stepson Ugo. Niccolo had them both beheaded in 1425, and ordered that all Ferrara's women convicted of adultery should be put to death. When it became clear that this edict threatened to depopulate Ferrara, it was no longer enforced. For the rest, Niccolo ruled well. He reduced taxes, encouraged industry and commerce, summoned Theodorus Gaza to teach Greek in the university, and engaged Guarino da Verona to establish at Ferrara a school rivaling in fame and result the school of Vittorino da Feltre at Mantua. Niccolo's son Leonello, who ruled from 1441 to 1450, was a rare phenomenon, a ruler both gentle and virile, refined and competent, intellectual and practical. Trained in all the arts of war, he cherished peace and became the favored arbiter and peacemaker among his fellow rulers in Italy. Taught letters and literature by Guarino, he became, a generation before Lorenzo de' Medici, one of the most cultivated men of the age. The learned Filelfo was astonished by Leonello's mastery of Latin and Greek, rhetoric and poetry, philosophy and law. This marquis was the scholar who first suggested that the supposed letters of St. Paul to Seneca were spurious. He established a public library, provided fresh funds and inspiration for the University of Ferrara, brought to its staff the best scholars that he could find, and participated actively in their discussions. No scandal or bloodshed or tragedy marred his reign except its tragic brevity. When he died at 40, all Italy mourned. A succession of able rulers continued the golden age that Leonello had begun. His brother Borso, from 1450 to 1471, was a man of sterner stuff, but he maintained the policy of peace, and Ferrara's prosperity became the envy of other states. He did not care for literature or art, yet he supported them amply. He administered his realm with skill and comparative justice, but he taxed his people heavily and spent much of their substance on court pageants and displays. He loved rank and title, and longed to be a duke like the Visconti of Milan. By expensive gifts, he persuaded the Emperor Frederick III to invest him with the dignity of Duke of Modena and Reggio, this in 1452, and marked the occasion with a costly festival. 19 years later, he secured from his other feudal lord, Pope Paul II, the title of Duke of Ferrara. His fame spread throughout the Mediterranean world. The Muslim sovereigns of Babylonia and Tunis sent him gifts, presuming him to be the greatest ruler in Italy. Borso was fortunate in his brothers, Leonello, who had given him the best of examples, and Ercole, who had refused to sanction a conspiracy to depose him, had remained his loyal aide to the end, and now succeeded to his power. For 6 years, Ercole continued the reign of peace, pageantry, poetry, art, and taxation. He cemented friendship with Naples by marrying King Ferrante's daughter, Eleonora of Aragon, and welcomed her with the most lavish festivities that Ferrara had ever seen, this in 1473. But in 1478, when Sixtus IV declared war on Florence because of its punishment of the Pazzi conspirators, Ercole joined Florence and Milan against Naples and the papacy. That war having ended, Sixtus induced Venice to join him in attacking Ferrara in 1482. While Ercole lay sick in bed, the Venetian forces advanced to within 4 miles of the city. The dispossessed peasantry crowded within the gates and joined in the general starvation. Then the temperamental pope, fearing that Venice, not the papacy or his nephew, would get Ferrara, made peace with Ercole, and the Venetians, retaining Rovigo, retired to their lagoons. The fields were planted again, food came into the city, trade was resumed, taxes could be gathered. Ercole complained that the fines levied for blasphemous profanity were falling away from the normal total of 6,000 crowns a year, possibly around $150,000. He could not believe that profanity was any less popular than before. He demanded strict enforcement of the law. Every penny was needed, for Ercole, perceiving that the people had multiplied beyond their housing, built an extension as large as the older city. He had this Addizione Erculea designed with such wide, straight streets as no Italian town had known since Roman days. The new Ferrara was the first really modern city in Europe. Within a decade, the growth and influx of population had filled the added space. Ercole raised churches, palaces, and convents, and coaxed holy women to make Ferrara their home. The focus of the people's life was the 12th century cathedral. The elite preferred the giant castello that Niccolo II had built in 1385 to protect the government from foreign attack or domestic revolt. Restored and transformed through 7 generations, its massive towers still dominate the central square of the city. Below are the dungeons in which Parisina and many others died. Above are the spacious halls adorned by Dosso Dossi and his assistants, where Duke and Duchess held court, musicians played and sang, dwarfs pranced, poets recited their verses, buffoons put on their antic jests, male sought female, ladies and cavaliers danced through the night, and on quieter days in quieter rooms dames and lasses read romances of chivalry. Isabella and Beatrice d'Este, born to Ercole and Eleonora in 1474 and 1475, grew up like fairy princesses in this environment of wealth and festival, war and song and art. But a fond grandfather lured Beatrice to Naples. A betrothed called her to Milan, and in that same year, 1490, Isabella left for Mantua. Their departure saddened many hearts in Ferrara, but their marriages strengthened the alliance of the Estensi and the Sforzas and Gonzagas. Ippolito, one of several sons, was made an archbishop at 11, a cardinal at 14, and became one of the most cultured and dissolute prelates of the age. We should in fairness note again that such ecclesiastical appointments, ignoring fitness and age, were part of the diplomatic alliances of the time. Alexander VI, Pope since 1492, was eager to please Ercole, for he aimed at making his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, the Duchess of Ferrara. When he proposed to Ercole that Alfonso, son and heir of the Duke, should marry Lucrezia, Ercole received the proposal coldly, for Lucrezia had not then the fumigated reputation that she has now. He finally consented, but after wringing from the eager father such concessions as made Alexander call him a haggling shopkeeper. The Pope was to give Lucrezia a dowry of 100,000 ducats, possibly $1.25 million. The annual tribute of Ferrara to the papacy was to be reduced from 4,000 to 100 florins, and the Duchy of Ferrara was to be settled by papal confirmation upon Alfonso and his heirs forever. Despite all this, Alfonso was reluctant until he saw the bride. We shall see later how he welcomed her. In 1505 he succeeded to the ducal throne. He was a new type among the Estensi. He had traveled through France, the lowlands, and England, studying industrial and commercial techniques. Leaving to Lucrezia the patronage of arts and letters, he devoted himself to government, machinery, and pottery. With his own hands he made a painted fine majolica and founded the best cannon of the time. He studied the art of fortification until he was the leading authority on the subject in Europe. He was normally a just man. He treated Lucrezia kindly, despite her epistolary flirtations. But when he dealt with external enemies or internal revolt, he gave scant play to sentiment. One of Lucrezia's ladies, Angela, charmed 2 of Alfonso's brothers, Ippolito and Giulio. In a moment of thoughtless arrogance, Angela taunted Ippolito by telling him that his whole person was worth less to her than the eyes of his brother. The cardinal, with a band of bravos, waylaid Giulio, and looked on while these pierced Giulio's eyes with stakes in 1506. Giulio appealed to Alfonso to avenge him. The Duke banished the cardinal, but soon allowed him to return. Stung by Alfonso's apparent indifference, Giulio conspired with another brother, Ferrante, to murder both the Duke and the cardinal. The plot was discovered, and Giulio and Ferrante were imprisoned in the cells of the Castello. Ferrante died there in 1540. Giulio was freed by Alfonso II in 1558, after 50 years of genteel confinement. He emerged an old man, white of hair and beard, and dressed in the fashion of half a century before. He died shortly after his release. Alfonso's qualities were what his government needed, for Venice was expanding into the Romagna and was plotting to absorb Ferrara. While Julius II, the new pope, resenting the concessions made to the Estensi in connection with Lucrezia's marriage, was resolved to reduce the principality to the status of an obedient and profitable fief. In 1508, Julius persuaded Alfonso to join with him and France and Spain in snubbing Venice. Alfonso agreed because he yearned to recover Rovigo. The Venetians concentrated their attack upon Ferrara. Their fleet, sailing up the Po, was destroyed by Alfonso's concealed artillery, and their soldiers were routed by Ferrari's troops under Cardinal Ippolito, who enjoyed war only next to Venery. When Venice seemed on the verge of defeat, Julius, not wishing to weaken irreparably the strongest Italian bulwark against the Turks, made peace with her and ordered Alfonso to do the same. Alfonso refused and found himself at war with both his enemy and his late ally. Reggio and Modena fell to the papal forces, and Alfonso seemed lost. In desperation, he went to Rome and asked the Pope for terms. Julius demanded the complete abdication of the Estensi and the absorption of Ferrara into the Papal States. When Alfonso rejected these demands, Julius tried to arrest him. Alfonso escaped, and after 3 months of disguises, wanderings, and perils, reached his capital. Julius died in 1513. Alfonso retook Reggio and Modena. Leo X resumed the war of the papacy for Ferrara. Alfonso, always improving his artillery and shifting his diplomacy, held his own obstinately until Leo II died in 1521. Pope Adrian VI gave the indomitable duke an honorable settlement, and Alfonso was allowed for a spell to turn his talents to the arts of peace. 2. The arts in Ferrara. Ferrari's culture was purely aristocratic, and its arts sedulously served the few. The ducal family, so often at war with the papacy, had no stronger stimulus to piety than to give a devout example to the people. Some new churches were built, but of no memorable quality. The cathedral received in the 15th century an unprepossessing campanile, a choir in the Renaissance style, and a pretty Gothic loggia and Virgin in its facade. Non ragionam di lor, ma guarda e passa. The architects of the time and their patrons preferred palaces. About 1495, Biagio Rossetti designed one of the finest, the Palazzo di Lodovico il Moro. According to a doubtful tradition, Lodovico had commissioned it in the thought that he might someday be driven from Milan. It was left unfinished when he was taken to France. Its cortile, with simple but graceful arcades, is among the lesser jewels of the Renaissance. Lovelier still was the court of the palace built for the Strozzi in 1499, and now named Bevilacqua, or Drinkwater, from a later occupant. Imposing is the Palazzo dei Diamanti, designed by Rossetti in 1492 for Duke Ercole's brother Sigismondo, and faced with 12,000 marble bosses whose diamond shape gave the building its name. Pleasure palaces were in fashion and had fancy names: Belfiore, Belriguardo, La Rotonda, Belvedere, and above all, the summer palace of the Estensi, the Palazzo di Schifanoia, or Skip Annoyance, or, as Frederick the Great would say, sans souci, without care. Begun in 1391, finished by Borso about 1469, it served as one home of the court, and as a dwelling for minor members of the ducal family. When Ferrara declined, the palace was turned into a tobacco factory, and the murals that Cosa, Tura, and others had painted in the main hall were covered with calcimine. In 1840 this was removed, and 7 of the 12 panels were salvaged. They constitute a remarkable record of the costumes, industries, pageantry, and sports of Borso's time, strangely mingled with personages from pagan mythology. These frescoes are the happiest product of a school of painting that for half a century made Ferrara a busy center of Italian art. Ferrari's painters humbly followed the Giottesque tradition until Niccolo III stirred the stagnant waters by bringing in foreign artists to compete with them: Jacopo Bellini from Venice, Mantegna from Padua, Pisanello from Verona. Leonello added stimulus by welcoming Rogier van der Weyden in 1449, who helped to turn Italian painters to the use of oil. In the same year, Piero della Francesca came from Borgo San Sepolcro to paint murals, now lost, in the ducal palace. What finally formed the Ferrara school was Cosimo Tura's zealous study of Mantegna's frescoes at Padua and of the techniques taught there by Francesco Squarcione. Tura became court painter to Borso in 1458, made portraits of the ducal family, shared in decorating the Schifanoia Palace, and won such acclaim that Raphael's father ranked him among the leading painters of Italy. Giovanni Santi apparently relished Cosimo's dignified and somber figures, his ornate architectural backgrounds, his landscapes of fantastic rocks. But Raffaello Santi would have missed in these pictures any element of tenderness or grace. We find those elements in Tura's pupil Ercole de Roberti, who succeeded his teacher as court painter in 1495. But this Hercules lacked power and vitality, unless we accept the Franz Halsian concert once ascribed to him in the London Gallery. Francesco Cosa, the greatest of Tura's pupils, painted in the Schifanoia 2 masterpieces rich in both vitality and grace: The Triumph of Venus and The Races, revealing the charm and joy of life at the Ferrara court. When Borso paid him for these at the official rate, 10 bolognini per foot of painted space, Cosa protested, and when Borso failed to see the point, Francesco took his talents to Bologna in 1470. Lorenzo Costa did likewise 13 years later, and the school of Ferrara lost 2 of its best men. Dosso Dossi revitalized it by studying in Venice in the heyday of Giorgione, from 1477 to 1510. Returning to Ferrara, he became the favorite painter of Duke Alfonso I. Ariosto, his friend, ranked him and a forgotten brother among the immortals. We can understand why Ariosto liked Dosso, who brought into his pictures an outdoor quality almost illustrative of Ariosto's sylvan epic, and bathed them in the warm colors that he had borrowed from the sumptuous Venetians. It was Dosso and his pupils who decorated the Sala di Consiglio in the Castello with lively scenes of athletic contests in the ancient style, for Alfonso liked athletics more than poetry. In his later years, Dosso painted with uneven hand the allegorical and mythological scenes on the ceiling of the Sala dell'Aurora. Here, pagan motives, rampant in Italy, triumphed in a celebration of physical beauty and sensuous life. Perhaps the decadence that now began in Ferrari's art, due chiefly to the exhaustive cost of Alfonso's wars, had one source in this victory of flesh over spirit. The passion and grandeur of the old religious themes faded from a largely secular art, leaving it predominantly decoration. The most brilliant figure in this decline was Benvenuto Tisi, named Garofalo, from his native town. On 2 visits to Rome, he became so enamored of Raphael's art that, though 2 years his senior, he enrolled as an assistant in the young master's studio. When family affairs recalled him to Ferrara, he promised Raphael to return, but Alfonso and the nobility gave him so many commissions that he could never tear himself away. He consumed his energy and divided his ability in producing a multitude of paintings, of which some 70 remain. They lack both force and finish, and yet one Holy Family in the Vatican shows how even the minor artists of the Renaissance could now and then touch greatness. The painters and the architects were only a fraction of the artists who labored to please the fortunates of Ferrara. Miniaturists produced there, as elsewhere in that eager age, works of a delicate beauty on which the eye rests longer and more contentedly than on many a famous painting. The Schifanoia Palace has preserved several of these gems of illumination and calligraphy. Niccolo III brought in tapestry weavers from Flanders. Ferrari's artists furnished designs. The patient art flourished under Leonello and Borso. The resulting tapestries decorated palace walls and were lent to princes and nobles for their special festivities. Goldsmiths were kept busy making ecclesiastical vessels and personal ornaments. Sperandio of Mantua and Pisanello of Verona made here some of the finest medallions of the Renaissance. Last and least was sculpture. Cristoforo da Firenze molded the man, Niccolo Baroncelli the horse, for a bronze statue of Niccolo III. It was set up in 1451, 2 years before Donatello's Gattamelata rose in Padua. Beside it, in 1470, was placed a bronze statue of Duke Borso, calmly seated as became a man of peace. In 1796, both monuments were destroyed by revolutionists who branded the bronzes as mementos of tyranny and melted them into cannon to end all tyranny and all wars. Alfonso Lombardi adorned the alabaster chambers of the Castello with stately statuary. Then, like so many Ferrari's artists, he decamped to Bologna, where we shall find him in glory. The court of Ferrara was too narrow in its ideas, tastes, and fees to transmute evanescent wealth into immortal art. 3. Letters. The intellectual life of Ferrara had 2 roots, the university and Guarino da Verona. Founded in 1391, the university had soon closed for lack of funds. Reopened by Niccolo II, it led a half-starved existence until Leonello, in 1442, reorganized and refinanced it with an edict whose prelude deserves commemoration. It is an ancient opinion, not only of the Christians but of the Gentiles, that the heavens, the sea, and the earth must someday perish. In like manner, of many magnificent cities, nothing but ruins leveled with the ground can now be seen, and Rome the conqueror herself lies in the dust and is reduced to fragments. while only the understanding of things divine and human, which we call wisdom, is not extinguished by length of years, but retains its rights in perpetuity. By 1474, the university had 45 well-paid professors, and the faculties of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine were rivaled in Italy only by those at Bologna and Padua. Guarino, born at Verona in 1370, went to Constantinople, lived there 5 years, mastered the Greek language, and returned to Venice with a cargo of Greek manuscripts. A legend told how, when a box of these was lost in a storm, his hair turned white overnight. He taught Greek at Venice, where he had taught Vittorino da Feltre among his pupils, and then at Verona, Padua, Bologna, and Florence, absorbing the classical scholarship of each city in turn. He was already 59 when he accepted an invitation to Ferrara. There, as tutor to Leonello, Borso, and Ercole, he trained 3 of the most enlightened rulers in Renaissance history. As professor of Greek and rhetoric in the university, his success was the talk of Italy. So popular were his lectures that students made their way through any rigor of winter to wait outside the unopened doors of the room in which he was scheduled to speak. They came not only from Italian cities, but from Hungary, Germany, England, and France, and many of them went forth from his instruction to fill vital posts in education, law, and statesmanship. Like Vittorino, he supported poor students out of his personal funds. He lived in humble quarters, ate but 1 meal a day, and used to invite his friends not to feasts, but to fave e favole, beans and conversation. He was not quite the equal of Vittorino as a moral paragon. He could pen virulent invectives like any humanist, perhaps as a literary game. But his 13 children were apparently begotten on 1 wife. He was temperate in everything but study, and he maintained health, vigor, and mental clarity till his 90th year. It was chiefly due to him that the Dukes of Ferrara supported education, scholarship, and poetry, and made their capital one of the most renowned cultural centers in Europe. The revival of antiquity brought with it a renewed acquaintance with classic drama. Plautus, son of the people, and Terence, manumitted darling of the aristocracy, came alive again after 15 centuries and were acted on temporary stages at Florence and Rome, above all at Ferrara. Ercole I in particular loved the old comedies and spared no revenues in producing them. One representation of the Mantegna cost him 1,000 ducats. When Lodovico of Milan saw a performance of this play at Ferrara, he begged Ercole to send the players to repeat it at Pavia. Ercole not only sent them, but went with them in 1493. When Lucrezia Borgia came to Ferrara, Ercole celebrated her hymeneals with 5 of Plautus's comedies performed by 110 actors, with lavish interludes of music and ballet. Guarino, Ariosto, and Ercole himself translated Latin plays into Italian, and performances were given in the vernacular. It was through imitation of these classic comedies that Italian drama took form. Boiardo, Ariosto, and others wrote plays for the ducal company. Ariosto drew up plans, and Dosso Dossi painted the fixed scenery for the first permanent theater of Ferrara and modern Europe in 1532. Music and poetry also won the patronage of the court. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.